A couple set out on what should have been a quiet winter hike. Just the two of them, bundled in love and laughter beneath falling snow. But they never came back. No calls, no footprints, just silence. For over a year, their vanishing became a haunting mystery, until their son found a single photo taken just hours before they disappeared. At first, it looked like nothing more than a final happy moment. But hidden in the corner was a clue so small, so easily missed, that would unravel everything. What he discovered in those frozen woods would shake a town, heal old wounds, and reveal a story of love that refused to die. Let us know where you're watching from, and if you're ready, come with us. This is one story you'll never forget. James. And Carol Whitaker had always dreamed of this road trip. After 40 years of working, raising 3 children, and spending more winters than they cared to count in the rainy suburbs of Portland, Oregon, they finally had the freedom and time to go exploring. Retirement had arrived like the sun after a long storm. They bought a used but reliable forest green Subaru Outback, stocked it with trail maps, blankets, a cooler full of sandwiches, and Carol's hand-labeled container of oatmeal cookies. Their route was mapped out with scenic byways through Idaho, down into the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming and Colorado, with plans to make it as far as Santa Fe if the roads held up. Their grown children, Julie, Ryan, and Mark, had waved them off from the driveway with laughter and a few half-joking warnings about icy mountain roads. But James had smiled in that calm, fatherly way of his and said, "We're not in a hurry. We'll drive safe. We're just out to breathe in some beauty." Carol leaned out of the window, blowing kisses as they drove off, the afternoon sun catching her white curls. Each evening, like clockwork, they sent a photo or short video in the family group chat. One day, it was a windswept vista overlooking Crater Lake. The next, it was Carol grinning in front of a giant wooden bear outside a general store in a mountain town. They wore matching red scarves in every photo, a Christmas gift from the grandkids. Keeping warm and stylish, Carol had joked. But it was the photo sent on the 5th day of their trip that would become the last. It arrived in the chat around 4:13 p.m. on a Thursday. The image showed James and Carol standing in front of a snow-covered lodge with pine trees fading into fog behind them. Their smiles were warm but tired. Snow dusted their hats and shoulders, and behind them, the peaks loomed high, the sky already darkening, though it was still afternoon. A caption followed, settling in for the night. "Storm coming in quick. More tomorrow. Love you all." Only tomorrow never came. When Julie texted the next morning to check in, there was no response. Not that morning or the next. Ryan called the lodge, but the phone line was dead. After another day of silence, the family began to panic. They contacted local authorities. A search began. Helicopters scanned the region. Rangers on snowmobiles checked mountain passes. The news carried stories of a historic snowstorm winds over 50 miles per hour, whiteout conditions, visibility near zero. Roads had vanished under feet of snow. It seemed impossible that anyone caught in it could have survived. Still, no one gave up. For nearly a week, search teams combed every known road and trail the Whitakers might have taken. But there were no tire tracks, no broken trees, no signs of a crash or stop. It was as if they had driven straight into the storm and disappeared. One ranger described the mountains as a vast white wall. Snow had sealed everything shut. What haunted the children most was the final photo. They printed it, stared at it, sent it to news stations, posted it on Facebook groups. People commented on how peaceful the couple looked, how love seemed to radiate from their smiles. But Julie, the eldest, said she couldn't stop staring at James's eyes in that photo. "He looks concerned," she said quietly, "like he's smiling for us. But there's something else." As weeks turned to months, the storm faded from memory. and the investigation slowed. Eventually, the search was called off. No wreckage, no tracks, no sign of the car, the couple, or where they might have gone. It was as if the storm had erased them from the earth. The lodge had been temporarily closed due to a power outage and storm damage, and no one there remembered seeing the couple that night. It was possible they had turned around or taken a different route before reaching the building. Possible, but the unknown grew heavier by the day. At the small memorial held in early spring, the children stood beside a wooden photo board covered with memories, wedding photos, birthday parties, and of course, that final picture. Friends brought casseroles and stories. There were quiet tears and moments of shared silence. But for Ryan, the youngest, there was no closure. He stood there long after others had gone, staring at the mountains in the distance. "I don't think they're gone," he whispered. "I think they're waiting for us to find them." He didn't know how or when, but something inside him refused to believe that this was the end of their story. And so the photo stayed on his desk, not as a goodbye, but as a starting point. A mystery that hadn't finished unfolding. By the time the authorities were officially alerted, the snow had already claimed the landscape. What began as a typical mountain storm had swelled into one of the worst blizzards Colorado had seen in over a decade. Winds howled through the canyons at 50, sometimes 60 miles per hour, lifting snow like smoke and hurling it into drifts that swallowed road signs, cabins, and even entire vehicles. Emergency lines were flooded with calls about downed trees, trapped tourists, and collapsed roofs. Rescue crews struggled to reach anyone. Roads that had been perfectly clear just a day earlier were buried under 5 feet of snow. The world had gone white and silent. For the Whitakers, who had sent their last photo just hours before the blizzard hit, time was the enemy. Investigators believed they had left the area surrounding the lodge shortly after snapping that picture, maybe to try reaching a smaller town just 20 miles downhill. But 20 miles in the mountains during a whiteout could be as unreachable as the moon. It wasn't uncommon for GPS signals to mislead drivers, especially in storm conditions, and it was possible, likely, even that the couple had taken a wrong turn. There were hundreds of winding offshoots from the main highway, many of them unplowed or abandoned, some not even marked on digital maps. Search and rescue teams were dispatched by foot, snowmobile, and helicopter, working in freezing temperatures and unpredictable terrain. Thermal imaging scans from above yielded nothing. No heat signatures, no overturned vehicle, no sign of life. Several times they thought they spotted tracks, but they always ended abruptly or disappeared into the snowfall. The possibility that the car had slid off an embankment and been covered by an avalanche was considered. In fact, it quickly became the leading theory. The problem was, avalanches had occurred in at least a dozen different areas that week, and covering every inch of the affected regions was impossible. For the family, the worst part wasn't knowing. The James and Carol were gone. It was not knowing how or where. Each new theory from the investigators was a dagger. Maybe they ran off the road in the storm and perished on impact. Or maybe, some dared to hope, they found shelter and were still alive, trapped somewhere deep in the woods. A few volunteers insisted on continuing the search after official efforts were suspended. But days turned into weeks, and the odds dwindled with each passing hour. After 21 days with no signs, the sheriff held a press conference. With somber eyes and a heavy voice, he announced that the search would be suspended unless new evidence emerged. The Whitakers were now classified as missing, presumed deceased. That phrase echoed in Julie's head for weeks. Presumed. It felt cruel, cold, and unfinished. In her dreams, she heard her mother's voice calling for help. Mark, the eldest son, turned inward, numbing himself with work and silence. But Ryan, the youngest, was the one who couldn't stop moving. He couldn't stop thinking about the photo. He pinned it above his desk and stared at it every night, wondering if it was more than just a farewell. In that picture, something didn't sit right with him. James had one hand in his coat pocket, something unusual for his father, who normally posed with his arm around Carol. And behind him, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow, was a dark shape. It looked like a post, maybe a sign, or a marker, but it was crooked, leaning oddly, and unlike anything Ryan recognized from other pictures they had sent. He started researching mountain trails, especially those near the lodge and its surrounding areas. He found maps, both digital and physical, and tried to match the background of the photo with known landmarks. But with so much snow in the image, the visual references were frustratingly vague. Still, Ryan kept at it, convinced that the key lay not in the storm itself, but in that single snapshot, frozen in time. Meanwhile, as winter gave way to spring, the snow began to melt. Hikers slowly returned to the backcountry. A few kept their eyes open for any signs of the missing Subaru, but nothing surfaced. It was as if the mountain had chosen to keep it secret. Nature, for all its beauty, could be merciless. The region had reclaimed what it had taken. No debris floated down rivers. No items washed up near the roads. No tracks emerged from under the thawing crust. It was as if James and Carol had simply ceased to exist once the storm arrived. The community moved on. News outlets stopped running the story. The lodge repaired its storm damage and opened again for summer tourists. Even local law enforcement stopped returning calls after a few months. But Ryan did not move on. He couldn't. He began collecting data, satellite images, weather reports, topographical maps. He reached out to wilderness guides, retired rangers, and amateur sleuths. His siblings worried about him, telling him gently to let it go, to grieve in a healthier way. But Ryan wasn't ready. Deep down, he believed the truth was still out there, somewhere beneath snow and time. And he believed that photo was speaking to him, if only he could learn to listen. Then, one night, as he scrolled through a wilderness forum, a comment appeared under the thread where he had posted his parents' last picture. A woman named Marlene, who described herself as a former hiker and amateur photographer, said she recognized something strange in the photo's background, something other people had missed. Her words were simple, but they sent a chill through Ryan's spine. "I think I've seen that trail marker before," she wrote. "It's not on modern maps, but I know exactly where it leads." In the months that followed the official suspension of the search, the world outside the Whitaker family seemed to carry on as if nothing had happened. Seasons changed, holidays passed, and friends who had once checked in weekly now reached out, only occasionally with gentle well wishes and hesitant questions. But inside the Whitaker household, time had stopped. Julie kept her parents' last voicemail saved on her phone and listened to it every few nights, as if the sound of her mother's laugh might somehow fill the hollow space left behind. Mark buried himself in spreadsheets and deadlines, convincing himself that productivity could mask pain. But it was Ryan who refused to accept that the story was over. Even as summer brought green to the valleys and washed the last traces of snow from the mountain roads, Ryan found himself increasingly drawn to that final photograph. It sat framed on his desk and served as the wallpaper on his phone. He couldn't explain it in words, but he felt deeply, almost obsessively, that the image was trying to tell him something. The longer he stared at it, the more convinced he became that there was a clue embedded in it, something just beneath the surface that no one had noticed. He would zoom in on the trees in the background, adjust contrast settings, overlay digital maps. To outsiders, it might have looked like the desperation of grief, but to Ryan, it was something else entirely. It was instinct. When he received Marlene's message that night, He stared at the screen for a long moment, heart pounding. Her comment had come unexpectedly on a backcountry hiking forum, where he had shared the photo along with a plea. If anyone recognizes this location or the trail in the background, please reach out. Dozens had offered thoughts most kind, all speculative, but none had sparked anything until Marlene's response. I think I've seen that trail marker before, she had written. It's old. Not on any current maps, but I remember it. Ryan replied instantly. Marlene, it turned out, was a former outdoor photographer who had spent much of the late 90s hiking lesser-known trails in the Rockies. She explained that the leaning post in the background of the Whitakers photo wasn't just a dead tree or accident of the terrain. It looked strikingly similar to a rare trail marker used by the Forest Service in the 1970s and 80s wooden posts, hand-carved with symbols indicating backcountry routes long since decommissioned. One in particular had stuck in her memory, a trail called Devil's Crest. She remembered it vividly because of its eerie name and the isolation of the terrain. The path had been closed decades ago after a series of rock slides rendered it unsafe. It hadn't appeared on any official hiking maps in years. Ryan's pulse quickened. He dug into state forestry archives, scouring decades-old trail documents and topographic surveys until he found a faint reference to Devil's Crest in a 1983 Ranger report. It was listed as permanently decommissioned due to repeated erosion, unstable terrain, and avalanche risk. The location aligned almost perfectly with the area where the Whitakers photo had been taken. Could it be possible, he wondered, that his parents had taken a wrong turn off a plowed road and somehow ended up near a forgotten trail, no longer maintained or marked? He took the theory to the local sheriff's office, bringing printed maps, highlighted documents, and enlarged versions of the photograph. The deputy on duty listened politely, flipping through the materials without much enthusiasm. Even if they did go down that way, he said finally, we're talking about rugged terrain. No access roads, no known shelters, and months of exposure. It'd be impossible to get a team back up there now, especially with how overgrown those paths are. Ryan nodded stiffly, knowing they wouldn't help. He walked out feeling more alone than ever. But where official channels failed, Ryan found determination. He began plotting the trail's supposed location himself using satellite imagery, cross-referencing every old map he could find. He reached out to Marlene again, who helped him approximate the old trailhead using GPS overlays. It was risky, remote, and dangerous. But Ryan couldn't ignore the pull in his chest that told him this was the right direction. He started preparing, buying hiking gear, stocking up on freeze-dried meals, investing in a reliable GPS beacon. When his siblings found out, they tried to intervene. Julie begged him to reconsider. "Ryan, they're gone," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "We have to find peace somehow. We can't keep living in a maybe." But Ryan looked at her with quiet certainty. "I'm not trying to chase ghosts," he said. "I'm trying to finish what they started. If that photo led them to a place no one remembers, then it's our job to remember. I have to see for myself." He reached out to retired park rangers, one of whom remembered Devil's Crest. The man, gray-haired and bent but sharp in memory, told Ryan that the trail had once been a quiet, rugged route that led to some of the most stunning and most dangerous overlooks in the state. After the third fatal rock slide in 5 years, the Forest Service had shut it down for good. The ranger pulled out an old hand-drawn map from a filing cabinet in his garage, yellowed with age but legible. "If your parents went that way," he said gravely, "there's no telling what they might have encountered." That night, Ryan packed his gear in silence. Before dawn, he left a note on his kitchen table for Julie and Mark. "Don't worry. I'm being careful. I just need to see for myself. If there's even a sliver of a chance They deserved to be found. He drove east, toward the mountains that had swallowed his parents whole, toward the image that refused to stop speaking, and toward a trail long forgotten by the world, but never by him. The road narrowed as Ryan left a last trace of town behind him, winding up through pine forests where the sunlight filtered down in slanted golden beams. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. With every mile, cell service faded, signs grew sparse, and snow patches still clung to the ground like ghosts of the storm that had swallowed his parents months earlier. His car hummed along the asphalt until he finally reached the edge of the wilderness, the last point reachable by vehicle. From here on, it would be his feet and his determination carrying him forward. In the passenger seat, beside an aging thermos and his father's old compass, lay a printed copy of the final photo. Ryan had studied it so many times it had practically burned itself into his mind. Yet now, holding it in the shadow of the very mountains where it had been taken, it felt heavier, more alive. He stepped out into the crisp air, slung his pack over his shoulder, and started walking. The terrain was both beautiful and brutal. Dense pine gave way to rocky outcroppings, and the higher he climbed, the more the air seemed to thin. He paused often, comparing his GPS position to the annotated map Marlene had helped him reconstruct. The trail marker in the photo had become his North Star. Marlene had identified it as a particular kind of Forest Service post carved with triangle notches, used only during a specific era to mark unofficial wilderness access points. She believed that it was the remains of one that once stood near the beginning of the Devil's Crest Trail. But she had also warned Ryan. The area had been prone to rock slides, and the terrain shifted unpredictably with each winter thaw. Path may not exist anymore, at least not in any recognizable form by late afternoon. Ryan stood in a narrow clearing framed by trees, leaning in like silent sentinels. There, almost hidden by undergrowth and fallen pine needles, he found what he had been searching for. A weather-worn wooden post, splintered at the top, its surface marked by time and decay. But even through the wear, he could see the faint carving, a triangle inside a circle, the same shape visible in the blurred background of the photo. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was where the picture had been taken. He looked around slowly. The mountains behind him, the slant of the hill, the lean of the trees, it all matched. He was standing in the exact place his parents had last been seen. But as he turned to look at the photo again, something struck him. Something he hadn't noticed before. Near the left edge of the image, half obscured by snowflakes and the motion blur of the camera, was a figure. It wasn't either of his parents. It stood much farther back at the tree line, indistinct and shadowed, like a smudge on the lens. It could have been anything, a tree, a shadow, a trick of the light. But now, standing in that very spot, Ryan could see where that figure would have been. And in that precise direction, about 30 yards into the trees, was something out of place. He moved toward it, heart pounding, brushing aside low branches until he reached a spot where the snowpack was thinner. There, protruding from the ground like the bones of some long-buried creature, was rusted metal. He dropped to his knees and cleared away the dirt and needles. It was the corner of a metal sign faded, but with a few letters still visible. Evils. C. Devil's Crest. The trail was real. His parents had been near it, maybe in preparing to follow it. But why? It wasn't on any modern map. They couldn't have known where it led, unless something or someone had directed them. Ryan sat back on his heels, staring at the sign and then back at the clearing. He imagined them here, his father trying to make sense of the path, his mother perhaps cold but curious, wondering whether they should press forward or turn back. Had the storm hit while they stood here debating their route? Or had they already made a decision that sealed their fate? A million possibilities whirled through Ryan's head. The mystery only deepened. That night, he made camp just off the trailhead. The sky overhead was vast and littered with stars, and the trees creaked softly in the wind. He couldn't sleep. Instead, he sat with the photograph in his hands, shining a flashlight over it again and again, comparing it to the trees, the trail marker, the surrounding slopes. Everything aligned. This was no coincidence. They had come here, and for some reason, they had veered off course and taken a path no one remembered Dot in the distance. A branch snapped, and he jumped, instinctively grabbing his flashlight. But there was nothing, only the deep darkness of the woods. Still, something about this place felt different. Not threatening, exactly. Just heavy. As if the forest remembered the next morning, he marked the trailhead on his GPS and took several photos from the exact spot where his parents had stood. He wasn't sure yet what they would lead to, but he knew now that he wasn't chasing shadows. There was a real trail, a real direction, and the first solid evidence that his parents hadn't simply vanished into the storm. They had chosen or been led to a place few had dared to tread in decades. And now, Ryan would follow Dot as he packed up his gear. He stared once more at the post, at the broken sign, and at the dense woods stretching ahead. Whatever answers lay beyond that forgotten trail, he would find them. Step by step, he would go where they had gone, chasing a memory through wilderness and silence. And just maybe, in the stillness of the trees, he would finally hear what the mountain had been holding back all this time. The morning sun broke through the treetops as Ryan stepped deeper into the wilderness, his boots crunching over frostbitten pine needles and patches of stubborn snow still clinging to the forest floor. The path beyond the broken signpost was barely visible, swallowed by years of neglect and silence. Trees leaned in from both sides, their branches forming a shadowed corridor that seemed to swallow sound and time. Every few yards, he would pause, adjusting his pack and scanning the area, looking for signs that this forgotten trail had once carried human feet. There were no footprints, no clear direction, just a whisper of wind in the branches and the overwhelming sense that he was walking straight into the unknown. But Ryan wasn't afraid. There was something about the air here, something quiet and sacred, like a memory still alive but buried. He pressed forward, step by careful step. He had left a detailed message with Marlene before leaving range of all signal, uploading his planned route and estimated return. She had tried to talk him into waiting for another experienced hiker to join, someone who knew the backcountry. But Ryan couldn't wait. Something inside him had taken over, a force deeper than reason, more urgent than fear. He had to go. Not because he believed he might find his parents alive, but because he knew their story hadn't ended in that snowstorm. Somewhere beyond the no maps, the truth waited. And he owed it to them, to their memory, to their love to finish the journey they had started. As the hours passed, he began to notice remnants of the old trail. A moss-covered log placed purposefully across a muddy slope, now half sunk into the earth. A series of stones arranged like forgotten steps up a small incline. And once, tucked behind a thicket of firs, he found a rusted aluminum canteen lying beside a rotting leather glove. He didn't know if it belonged to a ranger, a hiker, or someone like his parents, but it was a sign others had come this way. Once, he took photos, marked the location on his GPS, and kept going. By late afternoon, the trail wound upward, narrowing as it climbed along a ridge. The trees thinned, revealing glimpses of the valley below, endless waves of forest stretching into blue-gray mist. He stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop where the wind had carved strange shapes into the stone. As he sat and drank water, his eyes caught something glinting on the other side of the clearing. He rose slowly, walked across, and there, caught in the roots of a tree, was a thin piece of red fabric, faded, torn, but unmistakably cloth. His breath caught. His mother had always worn that red scarf. Could it be? Or was it just another coincidence, another cruel trick played by the wild? He crouched beside it, brushing away debris, and found it snagged on a low branch. The edge had frayed, but the fabric still held the faint floral pattern he remembered from childhood. A matching pair had been gifted to his parents last Christmas by his niece. He remembered the laughter when Carol had pulled hers on, claiming she'd never looked more fashionable. The scarf trembled in his hands as he held it close. It was hers. It had to be. He scanned the area, now with new urgency. If she had passed through here, then he was on the right track, or dangerously close to something they hadn't been prepared. For Dot, from that point forward, Ryan moved more slowly, eyes darting between tree trunks, ground, and sky. He didn't want to miss a single sign. The path grew steeper, and clouds began rolling over the peaks above. The weather was shifting. He checked his watch, just past 4. He had a couple of hours before the light gave out. Enough time to reach the next ridge and hopefully a clearer view of what lay ahead. He climbed a narrow slope where snow lingered thick beneath the shade. His boots slipped, and more than once, he had to steady himself with a gloved hand against the rocks. Then, just before the crest, he froze. A footprint. Not fresh, but human, unmistakably. The edges were soft, and it had likely been made months earlier during the thaw, but it was there. Beside it, barely visible, was the indent of what might have been a cane or a trekking pole. He dropped to his knees, brushing away more snow, and found several more impressions, leading downward away from the main path and toward a shallow ravine. He followed. The descent was rough, filled with loose stone and tangled roots, but he slid carefully, using his pole to steady each step. Then, through the trees, he saw it, a flash of metallic gray. He moved faster now, limbs shaking with adrenaline and dread. Pushing through the last of the brush, he came upon the edge of a slope and looked down. There, crumpled against a wall of rock, barely visible beneath branches and debris, was a vehicle. He knew it before he saw the license plate. The curve of the fender, the back window half shattered, the familiar green paint dulled by weather and time. It was his parents' Subaru. Half buried, quiet, and still, it had been waiting, unseen by helicopters and rescue teams, hidden by snow and trees and the terrible indifference of nature. Ryan didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, staring, heart pounding, unable to breathe. He had found them. Or at least, he had found the place where the road had ended. Tears filled his eyes, not just from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of what lay ahead. He didn't know what he'd find inside, what stories the wreckage still held, what truths waited in the silence. But he was ready. He stepped forward. The silence that surrounded the wrecked Subaru was almost too perfect. Ryan stood there for several long minutes, frozen, not out of fear, but reverence. The trees didn't move. The wind didn't blow. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Time had folded around this spot. The forest had kept this secret for nearly a year, burying it under snow and pine needles and memory. He finally stepped closer, knees trembling as he picked his way down the slope, careful not to dislodge the soft earth. The vehicle rested at a slight angle, its front end wedged against a rock face. One headlight was shattered, the other missing. Moss and lichen had begun to climb the tires. The windshield was broken, its spiderweb cracks filled with dirt and leaves, but most of the car was intact. This wasn't a high-speed crash. It looked more like the car had slid off the trail, maybe during the storm, and come to rest gently, tragically, where no one could find it. His breath came shallow as he reached the driver's side. He tried the door. It was jammed. Moving around to the passenger side, he pulled until the door creaked open. A rush of musty air escaped, stale and cold, filled with the scent of damp cloth and rusted metal. Inside, the seats were covered in debris, and pine needles littered the floor. He reached in slowly, heart in his throat, not sure what he would find. The glove box was open. An old map sat on the dash, folded and faded. There were crumbs on the seat, a thermos lying on the floor, a pair of Carol's knitted gloves on the dashboard. But no sign of James or Carol. The car was empty. That realization struck like a bolt. Empty. If they had died in the storm, why weren't they here? There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken glass inside. Their bags were gone too, but in the back seat, he spotted a blanket, the red and gray one his parents always brought on road trips. He remembered it draped over them during movie nights when he was a kid. He reached in and picked it up slowly, brushing off dirt. It smelled faintly of something floral, his mother's lotion, maybe. The scent hit him with unexpected force. They had survived the crash. They had gotten out, which meant they had continued on foot. But where? He stepped back and surveyed the area. To the north, the land dropped sharply into a ravine. To the east, the forest thickened. But to the west, the faint trace of an old trail seemed to continue, nearly lost beneath fallen branches and time. It sloped gently upward, winding between the trees, and something about it looked familiar, like the outline of a memory. Ryan pulled out the old map the ranger had given him and traced his finger along the faded ink. If this was truly Devil's Crest, then the trail should lead toward an old ranger outpost, abandoned decades ago. It would be a long shot, but it was something. He checked his pack, made sure his GPS beacon still worked, and marked the location of the car before beginning the ascent. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but certain elements gave it away, a line of stones bordering the edge. Barely visible notches in the trees where markers had once been nailed. As he climbed, he imagined his parents walking this same path. Perhaps arm in arm, James steadying Carol as she leaned into him for warmth. Had they hoped to find help? Shelter? Or had they simply followed the trail because it was the only direction that made sense? Hours passed. The sun slipped behind the ridge, and dusk fell like a curtain. Ryan found a small clearing near a cluster of boulders and made camp, lighting a small fire with the dry sticks he'd gathered. As he sat eating from a tin of beans, his eyes kept drifting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. He kept seeing them, his parents, moving through the shadows ahead of him, never turning around, always just a few steps out of reach. He felt closer to them than ever, but still, they remained just beyond his grasp. The night was long and restless. Owls called in the distance, and twice he thought he heard movement in the brush, but it was only deer passing through. In the early morning haze, he woke with a start. In the ash of the fire, something gleamed faintly metal, reflecting the first light of dawn. He leaned closer and picked it up. It was a small brooch, shaped like a rose, the kind Carol used to pin to her coats. His heart jumped. She had been here. It wasn't his imagination. They had made it this far. Fueled by renewed purpose, he packed quickly and pressed on. The trail grew rockier, narrower. Trees gave way to cliff edges, and twice he had to scramble over fallen logs and washed-out paths. But each hardship only made him more certain he was close. Then, around midday, the path turned sharply and opened onto a ridge that looked out over a wide valley. And there, nestled among the trees on the far side, was a shape. A building, weathered and sagging but standing. The ranger station. Ryan's heart pounded as he started toward it. If they had reached that building, if they had made it through the storm, then maybe, just maybe, what had felt like a tragic ending could still hold something more, something unexpected, something that would finally answer the question that had haunted them all. What happened after that final photo? The ranger station stood like a relic from another era, its weathered wooden frame leaning slightly, the roof sagging under years of snow and silence. Nature had begun to reclaim it, with moss creeping up the walls and vines curling through broken window panes. Ryan approached cautiously, heart thudding, each step echoing with the hope that this forgotten place might still carry the faintest breath of the past. The wooden steps creaked under his boots as he climbed the porch, brushing away a curtain of dead ivy that hung across the doorway. The handle resisted for a moment, then gave way with a reluctant groan as the door opened inward, revealing a dark, dust-choked interior that smelled of old timber and time. He stepped inside. The main room was a single open space, lit by slats of light pushing through warped boards. A wood stove sat in the corner, rusted shut, and an overturned chair lay beside a collapsed bunk bed. Shelves lined the far wall, still, holding a few rusted cans and cracked lanterns. But it was the center of the room that stopped him cold. A blanket lay spread out across the floor, gray and red, the exact one from the car. This wasn't a coincidence. His parents had been here. Recently or months ago, it didn't matter. They had made it this far. A thermos rested beside the blanket, and next to it, a notebook, his father's handwriting clear and familiar even through the dust and fading ink. Hand shaking, Ryan picked it up and opened the cover. The first few pages were water-damaged. The ink bled into pale blue streaks. But farther in, the words sharpened, and as he read, the past came flooding back in his father's voice. March 2nd, one entry began. We're safe for now. Car slid off the road, no serious injuries. Carol twisted her ankle, but we managed to get clear before the storm worsened. Took shelter in what looks like an old ranger station. It's cold, but it's better than nothing. We have a few supplies. Trying to conserve. Ryan's eyes filled with tears. His parents hadn't vanished. They had fought. They had survived. Another entry followed. March 3rd. The radio's dead. No signal. Storm hasn't let up. Snow nearly to the windows. Rationing food. Carol's ankle is worse. Swelling. She's trying not to show it, but I can see the pain. Then, further down the page, March 5th. Thought I saw movement in the woods. Maybe an animal. Too far to tell. Carol's fever is climbing. I don't know what else to do. Ryan turned the pages slowly, reverently, absorbing each one like scripture. There were notes about melting snow for water, breaking apart furniture, for firewood, and a strange entry that made him pause. March 6th. Heard a noise last night, like a voice. Not sure if I'm imagining things. Carol thought she heard it too, a whisper outside the walls. Couldn't find any tracks this morning. The pages after that grew shorter, more hurried. His father's handwriting wavered. March 7th. Leaving in the morning. Not enough food. Can't stay here. Carol insists she can walk. I don't know. God help us. The final entry came on March 8th. Just one line. Heading west. If anyone finds this, we tried. Ryan sat on the edge of the blanket, the notebook clutched to his chest, the silence around him broken only by the sound of wind curling through the gaps in the wood. They had made it through the crash, made it to shelter, and even in the heart of the storm, they hadn't given up. But then they had left. They had walked west into deeper wilderness, into uncertainty. Maybe they were looking for a road, a cabin, a rescue team. Maybe they thought help was just over the next hill. But now, Ryan knew where to go. He searched the rest of the cabin, hoping for more. In a drawer, he found a compass, its glass cracked but still pointing north. In the ashes of the stove, half-burnt scraps of paper, one of which bore his mother's. Handwriting. Love you always, it read. His throat tightened. These were not just clues. They were fragments of life, moments preserved in dust and ink and silence. And they were leading him on, urging him forward, stepping back outside. Ryan looked toward the western edge of the clearing. The trail was faint, nearly erased by time, but it was there, a slight depression in the earth, a shift in how the trees grew, as if once, long ago, footsteps had pressed a path through the forest. He packed the notebook carefully, tucked the brooch and compass into a side pocket, and slung his bag back over his shoulder. He wasn't done. Not yet. His parents had left behind more than memories. They had left a path. One final journey. The sky had begun to cloud again, a pale gray sweeping in from the north, but Ryan wasn't afraid. He was walking now with purpose, following not just a trail, but a story that had waited too long to be told. And somewhere out there, in the hush between the trees, the ending waited. Maybe it would bring peace, or maybe pain. But whatever he found, it would be truth. And that was more than he'd had in months. He took one last look at the cabin, standing quiet and resolute, as if watching over the forest like an old sentinel. Then he turned, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the forgotten trail once more. The forest beyond the ranger station grew denser, older, as though Ryan had stepped into a realm time had forgotten. The air was colder here, heavier, and every step forward felt like peeling back a layer of silence that had rested undisturbed. For decades. The narrow path sloped downward at first, then bent sharply west, aligning exactly with the direction his father had written in the final entry. Ryan moved carefully, avoiding loose rock and watching for subtle signs: scuffed bark, broken twigs, depressions in the mossy ground. Every now and then, he paused to listen, to breathe, to feel. The wilderness didn't speak in words, but there was something in the way the wind moved through the trees and the way the branches arched above him, as if they too remembered. And then, not long after midday, he stumbled onto something he hadn't expected. A grave marker dotted first. He thought it was a weathered log protruding from the earth, but the way it stood angled and still made him pause. He knelt beside it and brushed away leaves and dirt. What emerged was a wooden plank, partially buried, with carved letters nearly smoothed away by time and weather. But even through the wear, he could make out two words: Ranger John. No last name, no dates. Just that simple, solemn declaration. Beside the marker, the earth had been turned and settled, shaped into a shallow mound. A grave. Ryan sat back on his heels, a strange unease crawling into his spine. This was no ordinary trail. And whoever Ranger John had been, someone had taken. Care to bury him. But why here? So far from anything. And when? He looked around, searching for more signs. 20 feet from the grave, nestled beneath the roots of an old pine, something glinted. He walked over, knelt, and began to dig with his hands. The soil was soft but damp, and before long, his fingers struck metal. He pulled out a rusted tin box, sealed with a leather strap now brittle with age. Gently, he opened it. Inside were old photographs, their edges curled and colors faded. Black and white images of a young man in a ranger uniform, smiling beside a cabin, standing with a rifle in front of a storm-swept valley. Notes accompanied the photos, written in blocky, masculine script. One caught his eye. It was a letter, addressed, "To whom it may concern." He unfolded it carefully. "My name was John Elroy," it began. "If you're reading this, then either I finally lost the battle with this place, or someone's come looking for what no one else dared to. I was stationed here in 1979. I saw things, heard things. People vanished out here more than the news ever reported. Hikers, campers, a pair of geologists. Each time, no explanation, no trail, just gone. We reported it, but the brass buried the stories, said it would hurt tourism. So they closed the trail, said it was too unstable. That was a lie. The truth is, something watches from the ridge." Ryan's hands went still. His heart thudded as he continued reading. "I tried to leave once," the letter went on. But every time I packed up, something pulled me back. Sounds in the trees, voices at night. I thought I was going mad. Maybe I was. But then, one winter, I found a boy alone, barefoot, in the snow. He didn't speak, just pointed toward the western ridge and vanished, like smoke. That's when I knew I couldn't leave. Not without warning others, so I stayed. I watched. I wrote it all down. If you're here, be careful. Don't follow the voices. Don't stray off the old trail. If you hear your name whispered, don't answer. And if you see the boy, turn around. Ryan stared at the letter for a long time. The woods around him felt suddenly closer, darker, as though leaning in to listen. He looked back toward the grave, then down at the box still resting in his lap. He had come here for truth, for closure, but now he wasn't sure if what he'd found was either. Still, something about the letter rang honest, not just in its details, but in its pain. Ranger John hadn't been a myth. He'd lived here, died here, and left behind a warning buried in the roots of a pine tree dot as the afternoon light began to fade. Ryan carefully replaced the photos and letters in the box and returned it to the earth. He marked a spot on his GPS, took a final look at the grave, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he turned back toward the trail. The wind had picked up, and through the trees came a long, low groan that might have been a distant gust or something else. He didn't wait to find out. The path westward twisted steeply now, and he moved faster, driven by something more than determination. It wasn't fear exactly, but an urgency born from the knowledge that time was thin out here, stretched taut, like thread. His parents had walked this same path, had passed by that grave, maybe even seen that same box. Did they read the warning? Did they hear the voices? As twilight settled over the forest, Ryan found a small ridge to make camp. He'd built. No fire this time. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the tree line, the shadows flickering just beyond sight. He thought of his father's journal, his mother's scarf, the brooch, the photo, the crash car, all fragments of a journey that had somehow become his own. He wasn't just retracing their footsteps anymore. He was unraveling a mystery that had haunted this land long before they ever arrived. Somewhere ahead, but truth waited. Maybe it would bring him to the end of the trail, or maybe it would change everything he thought he knew. Either way, he would keep going, because whatever the forest held, his parents had faced it. And now, so would he. The morning light crept slowly through the pines, casting long, gray streaks across the damp forest floor as Ryan opened his eyes to the eerie stillness. Sleep had not come easily. He had laid awake for hours, heart pounding, ears straining to catch the faintest sound, half expecting to hear footsteps or whispers in the dark. The forest had a pulse, and last night it had felt too alive, as though the trees themselves were watching. But now, as the day broke over the canopy, the world was hushed again, blanketed in that strange, unnatural calm he was beginning to associate with this trail. He packed his things swiftly, wanting to put distance between himself and Ranger John's grave. Not out of fear exactly, but from the weight of something he couldn't name. The knowledge that someone had died here, not just from exposure or injury, but from some deeper, invisible force lingered in the air like fog. He started walking west again, boots pressing into soft earth, the sound of his footsteps the only companion. The path narrowed until it wasn't really a path anymore, just a suggestion of one. Trees grew closer together, and underbrush thickened, snagging at his clothes as he pushed forward. Then, just before noon, he saw something that made him stop cold. A shoe, half buried beneath a blanket of moss, its laces frayed and fabric nearly consumed by dirt, but unmistakably a hiking shoe. He crouched down, brushed away the debris, and recognized it. Not just the model or the brand. This exact shoe had belonged to his mother. He remembered it clearly, the dark blue stitching, the faded logo, the way she always tied the laces twice. A sound escaped his throat, not quite a sob, not quite a word. She had been here. Not far behind the shoe, he found a torn piece of jacket green, nylon, lined with fleece. His father's. The ground around him seemed suddenly sacred, as if it held the echoes of their last steps. He looked up slowly and scanned the forest ahead. The terrain dipped, then opened into a small glade ringed by granite boulders and towering pines. At the center stood a narrow wooden structure, crooked and covered in moss. It looked like an old emergency shelter, maybe erected decades ago for rangers or lost hikers. Ryan approached with hesitant reverence, each step slower than the last. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open with trembling fingers. The scent of rot and dust rushed out at him, sharp and earthy, and he stepped inside. The interior was cramped, no more than 8 feet across. A wooden bench ran along one wall, and a small cast-iron stove stood in the corner. There was no electricity, no running water, just shelter from the wind. And in that room, Ryan saw what he had both longed for and feared most. In the far corner, tucked beneath a blanket that looked stiff with time, were 2 figures, still, silent, resting side by side. He stopped breathing. For a moment, he couldn't move. The air inside the cabin was heavy, unmoving. He stepped forward slowly, the floor groaning under his weight. Kneeling down, he gently pulled back the edge of the blanket. Even in death, there was peace on their faces. His father lay with one arm curled protectively around his mother, who looked as though she had simply drifted off to sleep. They were together. They had made it here. Somehow, against every odd, they had found this place and sheltered together in their final hours. Ryan's heart cracked open as tears spilled freely down his cheeks. All the searching, the questions, the sleepless nights, it had led to this moment, this quiet, sacred place where love had outlasted the storm. He sat beside them for a long time. He didn't speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. The silence held everything. Eventually, he found a small tin box near the stove. Inside was a final note, written in his father's hand. To our son, it read, "If you find this, then you've come farther than we ever dreamed. We tried to make it. We tried everything. Your mother was in pain, but she never complained. She was stronger than I ever deserved. We stayed here together, and we found peace. Please, don't be sad. We loved our life. We love you. If you can, take us home. But if not, know that this was enough. We were never lost, just waiting." Ryan clutched the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking. The grief was immense, but beneath it, there was also something else: relief. They hadn't vanished into some terrible unknown. They had lived, loved, endured. They had left behind not just their bodies, but their story. And now it would be told. He stepped outside as clouds gathered overhead, and a soft snow began to fall. He looked up into the gray sky and whispered, "I found you." And the forest, quiet and vast, seemed to breathe back in response. Ryan knew he couldn't carry them out alone. He marked the shelter on his GPS, took photos, and left a ribbon of bright red cloth tied to a nearby tree to mark the path. Then, with the notebook, the letter, and the weight of both loss and love in his heart, he turned back. Not because the journey was over, but because now, finally, he could begin the process of bringing them home. As he retraced his steps through the pines, he didn't feel alone. The trail no longer felt haunted or cursed. It felt sacred. A place of memory. A place where the last photo had led him not to despair, but to resolution. He had made a shocking discovery. Yes, but it was also beautiful. Because in the deepest part of the wilderness, he had found what mattered most. Not just answers, not just closure, but the enduring trace of love that never truly dies. The walk back through the forest felt different now. The same twisted trees and overgrown trail that once loomed with uncertainty now carried a quiet reverence. Every step Ryan took was heavier, not just from the weight of exhaustion, but from the profound sorrow and solemn duty resting in his heart. Behind him, in that crooked shelter tucked between the granite boulders, his parents still lay as they had for nearly a year, embraced in their final sleep. He had not disturbed them. He could not yet. But he had made a promise, silent and sacred, whispered into the stillness as the snow fell softly on the roof above them. He would take them home. Retracing the trail was slower than the journey. His legs were tired, but his mind worked constantly, replaying every image, every word of his father's final letter. He thought about how alone they must have felt in their final days, yet how determined they had remained. They had not given up. They had endured cold, pain, fear, and still they chose to rest side by side rather than fall apart. That strength moved in him now like a quiet fire, guiding his every step. He paused often to mark the path more clearly this time, using bright strips of cloth, GPS pins, even scratches in bark where necessary. This wasn't just a return. This was the first step in opening the forest to truth. People had to know by dusk. He reached the ranger station once again. It stood in the same silence, its walls whispering stories of all it had seen. He entered and took one last look at the place where his parents had left clues of their passage. The blanket, the journal, the brooch. He gathered them carefully, packed them into a weatherproof pouch, and promised himself they would never again be lost to the wilderness. That night, he made camp beside the station. The fire flickered quietly, casting orange light over the nearby trees, and for the first time since he'd entered this forest, Ryan let his shoulders relax. Not from safety, but from something deeper clarity. He now knew what had to be done. The next morning, he descended the trail toward the valley, reaching the ridge where the car had rested. Seeing it again, now with the knowledge of what had happened after they left it, made his chest ache with grief. But it also felt like a chapter turning. He radioed for help once back within range of signal. His voice cracked as he gave the coordinates, explaining only what was necessary. "I found them," he said, and the silence on the other end told him the ranger on duty understood exactly what that meant. Within hours, a team of recovery personnel was assembled. Ryan met them at the trailhead the next morning, his pack heavy with evidence, his heart heavier with purpose. Among the group was Marlene, eyes red-rimmed but firm. She hugged him tightly, then held his face in her hands. "You did it," she whispered. "You really found them." The hike back into the wilderness, now accompanied by trained rangers and medics, felt surreal. Ryan led them, recounting the path, pointing out the markers he'd made, answering questions without hesitation. When they reached the grave of Ranger John, the team paused. No one said anything, but each person stood a little straighter afterward, as if honoring an unspoken history. Finally, they reached the shelter. Ryan stepped aside, letting the others move forward with care and respect. They entered slowly, one by one, their movements deliberate and gentle. He stayed outside, staring up into the trees, trying to imagine what his parents had seen in their last days. The shifting skies, the snow drifting through the branches, the hope that someone someday might find them. When the team emerged, one of them gave him a solemn nod. "They were at peace," he said simply. That was all Ryan needed to hear. The process of recovering the bodies was long and delicate. The shelter had to be reinforced temporarily and a stretcher system constructed from available materials. Ryan insisted on walking behind them as they carried his parents back, not out of obligation, but devotion. Every step down the mountain was a step toward home, toward closure, toward giving them the burial they deserved. not beneath snow and pine needles, but under the open sky, surrounded by family and loved. As they neared the trailhead, news crews had already begun to gather. The story had reached the media, and Ryan felt their cameras waiting like hungry eyes behind the tree line. He wasn't ready to speak, not yet. This wasn't their moment to capture. It belonged to his parents, to the forest, to all the silent things that had remained unseen and unheard for far too long. He stepped aside as the stretchers passed, his eyes wet, his voice quiet. "We're almost there," he whispered. "You're going home." And though the snow had begun to fall again, it felt different now, not like a warning, but a blessing. Each flake landing on his jacket, on the trees, on the stretchers below, seemed to soften the pain and light the path. The mountain had held them, yes, but now it had let them go. The memorial service was held on a crisp Saturday morning, just 2 weeks after the bodies of James and Carol Holloway were brought down from the mountain. The church was small, white-paneled, with a modest steeple that had watched over their little town for nearly a century. It was the same church where they'd been married, where Ryan had been baptized, and where, through the seasons of joy and heartbreak, the town had always come to bear witness to life's most meaningful passages. On that morning, the pews were filled to the brim. People came not only from across town, but from neighboring counties, some who had known James and Carol personally, and others who had only known their story. Their disappearance had left a quiet ache in the hearts of many. Their return, even in death, stirred something deeper, a need to honor, to remember, to say goodbye. Ryan sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the two urns resting at the altar, each draped with a photo one of his mother laughing in her garden, sunlight catching her silver hair, the other of his father by the lake, holding a fishing rod and grinning like a boy. They looked alive. That, Ryan thought, was the strange gift of photographs. They froze people in their happiest flickers, sometimes so perfectly that you almost forgot they were gone. But there was no forgetting today. The weight of their absence sat heavy on every shoulder in that room. Yet the air wasn't filled with despair. It was filled with stories. One by one, people stood to speak. A neighbor recalled how Carol always brought soup to anyone sick on the block, no matter the hour. A former co-worker of James talked about his deep patience and the way he listened without judgment. An old friend choked back tears as she described summer nights on their porch, the scent of jasmine in the air, and how Carol's laughter could be heard from the sidewalk. Even the mailman stood, voice quiet, remembering how James had once helped him push his stuck truck out of the snow, then invited him in for coffee. Every memory added a brushstroke to a portrait that had never really faded, just gone quiet for a while. When it was Ryan's turn, he walked slowly to the pulpit. The room stilled. He looked out over the faces, some lined with age, others wide-eyed and young, and drew a deep breath. For most of this past year, he began, voice firm but soft, I lived in the in-between, between hope and grief, between not knowing and fearing the worst. I held on to a photo, a final one taken just before they disappeared, and I looked at it more times than I can count, searching for answers in their eyes. I wondered if they were scared, if they had felt alone, if they had known they wouldn't make it back. He paused, swallowing hard. But when I found them, I found something else too. I found strength. I found love that had not wavered in the face of cold or fear or time. They didn't die lost. They died together, holding on to each other, holding on to hope. There were tears in many eyes as he continued, but also soft smiles. And I know now that the photo wasn't just a goodbye. It was a promise that wherever they went, they would face it side by side. They gave me that gift. They gave us that legacy, not one of tragedy, but of devotion. His voice trembled as he finished. So today, I don't say goodbye to the people we lost. I say thank you for showing me what it means to love without limits, to endure, to believe, and for always, always finding the way back, if not to home, then to each other. As he stepped down, the organ played a quiet hymn, the same one that had filled the church on their wedding day so many years ago. The congregation joined in, voices lifting gently, not in sorrow but in reverence. Afterward, people gathered outside beneath the wide oaks, where a memorial garden had been planted in their honor. 2 stone benches faced a flower bed now freshly blooming with the first tulips of spring. A bronze plaque read, "In memory of James and Carol Holloway, who walked into the wilderness and never let go of each other." Marlene stood beside Ryan, a cup of coffee in hand, watching as townsfolk wandered through the garden, touching the flowers, some laying small tokens, a painted rock, a folded note, a photograph. "They would have loved this," she said softly. Ryan nodded. "They always said they wanted their lives to mean something, even if it was just in small ways." Marlene smiled, her eyes shining. "Well, I say they got their wish." News outlets later reported the story, calling it many things: a tragic love story, a mystery solved, a testament to human resilience. But to the town, it was simpler than that. It was the return of 2 souls who had never truly left. In the weeks that followed, hikers and travelers began visiting the trail again, many leaving offerings at the ranger station, others quietly tracing the same path Ryan had walked. The forest, once feared, became a place of pilgrimage, not because it was haunted by loss, but because it had become sacred with memory. Ryan continued visiting the trail often, sometimes alone, sometimes with those who wanted to hear the story firsthand. He never embellished it. The truth, he had learned, didn't need decoration. It held power all on its own. And with every step, he felt his parents walking with him, not as ghosts or grief, but as part of the very air around him. Steady as the trees, strong as the love that had brought them home. Weeks passed after the service, and though the town slowly returned to its rhythmed school bells ringing, calf doors swinging open each morning, neighbors chatting over hedges, Ryan's world still moved to a different tempo. He spent most days organizing his parents' belongings, sorting through albums, letters, and old keepsakes, each object whispering fragments of their lives. But one thing kept returning to him, over and over, like a persistent echo: the photo. The final photo. The one taken just hours before they vanished, smiling beneath a blanket of snow, unaware that the next steps they took would become the mystery of a year. It had hung on his refrigerator for months, studied, touched, even prayed over. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered within it, just beyond reach. One afternoon, as late spring light spilled through the kitchen window, and birdsong danced in the air, Ryan sat down once again with the photo. He held it closer this time, not with the desperation he once had, but with a gentler, steadier focus. He studied the background, the trees, the slope of the trail, the tilt of the sunlight. Then, for the first time, he noticed something strange. Just behind his father's shoulder, half obscured by a drift of snow and the glare of light, was the faint outline of a signpost. It wasn't a trail marker he recognized. It was old, wooden, barely legible in the blur, but there was definitely a sign there. That hadn't been mentioned in any maps, nor had he seen it on his hikes. Something about it tugged at him. He retrieved the digital version of the photo and pulled it up on his laptop. With a few adjustments, brightness down, contrast up, shadows lifted, the image sharpened. And then he saw it. The sign read, "Ridge Lookout minus 0.2 miles. Direction arrow pointed upward and to the left, toward a section of forest he hadn't explored. It wasn't marked on the modern trail maps, likely decommissioned years ago. But the photo made it clear. His parents had seen it. And maybe, just maybe, they had gone there before heading to the shelter. The thought gnawed at him. What if they had left something behind? What if that moment captured with such simplicity held the one piece he hadn't yet uncovered? He felt it again, that inner nudge, not of grief this time, but of unfinished truth. The very next day, Ryan returned to the trailhead. Spring had awakened the forest. Wildflowers bloomed along the lower paths, and the snow had melted in most places, revealing soft earth and vibrant moss. It felt kinder now, more forgiving, as if the land itself had exhaled. He made his way quickly to the area near where the photo had been taken, using a printed version as reference. Matching trees, rocks, and angles, he finally found the spot. And sure enough, just to the left, mostly hidden by an outcrop and a thick tangle of brush, stood what remained of the sign. Time had nearly erased it, most of the lettering gone, wood splintered, but the direction was still clear. He followed the path the arrow had once promised, brushing aside branches and stepping over fallen logs. It wasn't long, perhaps 15 minutes of climbing before he reached a ridge that opened into a stunning view. The land dropped away into a wide valley, with mountains rising in the distance, their snowcaps gleaming in the sun. But it wasn't the view that stopped him. It was the bench. An old weather-worn bench, carved from thick cedar, sat at the ridge's edge. Faded initials J+K were carved into the armrest. His parents' initials. And next to it, tucked beneath a flat stone, was a small tin box. Hands trembling slightly, Ryan lifted it. Inside, there was no grand revelation. Just a note, folded carefully in his mother's handwriting. "If anyone finds this," it read, "know that we sat here, that we breathed in this view, that we loved each other without fear, even knowing the storm was coming, and that if we don't return, we're still together right here." Ryan sank onto the bench, the paper clutched in his hand, and looked out over the vast stretch of land. The wind curled softly around him, lifting his hair, whispering through the trees. They had come here before they died. They had seen this view, carved their names, left a piece of themselves not just in memory, but in place. It wasn't just a final clue. It was a gift. He stayed on that ridge for hours, the sun sinking slowly behind the hills, casting gold across the valley. He thought about everything the photo had led him to the crash site. The ranger's journal, the shelter, the love letter, the grave, the town's healing, and now this quiet corner of the world where love had taken root. They hadn't been lost. Not really. They had left a trail of breadcrumbs, not out of fear, but out of faith that someone who loved them enough would find the pieces and put them together. That someone had been him. As twilight deepened and stars began to blink into the sky, Ryan stood and placed the note gently back in the box. He didn't seal it. Let someone else find it one day. Let them feel what he had felt, that stories don't end. They echo. That grief may settle, but love endures. That the final photo didn't just capture a moment, it preserved a path. And in following it, he had found not just answers, but a way forward. He looked back once more, then turned to the trail. The woods behind him sighed gently in the breeze, and ahead, the path stretched quietly toward home.